Hey everybody, Mr. Regan here, and today we're going to start off by looking at what we accomplished in our previous lab and kind of what our big takeaways are as we review how this all applies to our space pod. So prior to today, you guys have been working a lot with velocity and force, and we did a lot of practice with our lids and our springs, and we looked at how as we apply different forces, we can create different velocities in an object. But our lab this time around was a little different. Now we were applying the same force to two of the same objects to see what's going on with an object's velocity when we apply the same force to two very different objects. And as we did that, we really explored all these big ideas. We hopefully recognize that we have two different masses within our objects here. Mass is all of the stuff that makes up these objects, or the matter more specifically that makes up these two objects, and realize that one was, slightly heavier than the other. When we applied that same force, so whether it was that first notch on that spring, second notch, or third, no matter what force we applied to both, we found that one object's velocity would go a little faster than the other's velocity each time. So at force one of our objects would always move faster than the other, no matter whether it was a small amount of force or a large amount of force, either way. And as we looked at that lab, we were able to calculate velocity by looking at its overall speed. And that's where we have our calculations here. As we calculated the velocity of our two objects, we realized that though they were going in the same direction, their speed was going to be slightly different from one another. Though the forces were the same, the speed would be different. So we had our independent variable, which was the overall mass of our objects. We were changing the mass. This one was obviously slightly heavier than this one. And our dependent variable was going to be the velocity at which these objects traveled in a specific direction. So as they traveled, one was faster than the other. We calculated that by dividing the distance that the two objects traveled and the time it took them to get there. So we did that calculation for speed. And then we figured out, if they're both going in the same direction, one might be faster than the other. All of this to obviously help us understand our pod and what's going on. Now, we're going to explore how this applies to our pod in a later task within this lesson. But before we do that, we were going to talk quickly about this idea of confirming other scientists' conclusions. So in the science world, anytime a scientist does an experiment, other scientists will replicate that experiment, or they will do the lab over to confirm the results, or they'll do another variation in the lab to see if they get the same conclusions that the scientists got from their previous lab. They do this for two important reasons. One, to allow scientists to see if they came to the same conclusions or different conclusions than the scientists, and two, to see if they collect similar or different data. If scientists are able to replicate an experiment and draw the same conclusions, then they usually will confirm and say, yeah, this lab is a good lab, this experiment is a good experiment. We can say the conclusions are strong. If they come to different conclusions and they have very different data, then scientists can begin to really think about, what made this lab good? What made this lab bad? What can we change within those independent, dependent, and control variables to maybe see if we can get similar conclusions and data. So your job, ladies and gentlemen, now is going to be to think about how would you create a lab with similar variables in order to confirm the results of our golf ball and ping pong ball test. Think about the things you have at home. Think about where you would set it up, how you'd set it up, what things you would use. And from there, you're going to reflect and complete the reflection question. If you do have questions, reach out to me. Otherwise, good luck.